Of course, we worked together. I always had a dream when I was a small boy that I wanted to marry a girl with whom I would work together. And I think it's a perfect way of marriage.
For most people, André Rieu is the man who made classical music feel like a party. The tall, curly-haired Dutchman with the warm smile and the flying violin bow has spent decades filling stadiums across the world with the sound of Viennese waltzes, bringing audiences to their feet in places where classical music had never before been welcomed. He is, by almost every measure, one of the most successful live performers in the world, outselling rock bands, filling arenas that most orchestras could only dream of, and doing it all while wearing a tailcoat and grinning, as though he is having the time of his life. But beneath the glittering chandeliers and the sweeping melodies, there was a dimension of André Rieu's life that he kept carefully tucked away from public view for nearly 3 decades. Not a scandal in the tabloid sense, not a crime or betrayal, but something far more quietly remarkable, a private world, a hidden discipline, a second identity that coexisted with his fame and yet remained almost entirely invisible to the millions of fans who believed they knew everything about the man on stage. And now, as the layers of that carefully maintained private life begin to peel away, the full picture of who André Rieu really is, and always has been, is finally coming into focus. André Rieu was born on October 1st, 1949, in Maastricht, a historic city in the southern Netherlands that sits at the meeting point of Belgium, Germany, and Dutch culture. It is a city of stone bridges, Roman ruins, and a deep, almost instinctive appreciation for art and music. For the Rieu family, music was not a leisure activity or a cultural pursuit. It was the very air they breathed. André's father, André Rieu Sr., was a distinguished conductor who led the Maastricht Symphony Orchestra, and the family home was essentially an extension of the concert hall. Musicians came and went. Sheet music cover tables. Rehearsal sounds drifted through open windows. For a young boy growing up in that environment, the boundary between ordinary life and musical life simply did not exist. What made young André different from many children who grow up in musical households was not just his exposure to music, but his particular sensitivity to it. He did not simply hear the music around him. He felt it. Among all the instruments that filled his childhood world, it was a violin that seized his imagination most completely. There was something about its voice, the way it could express grief and joy within the same phrase, the way a skilled player could make it sob or soar, that spoke directly to something deep within him. Long before he could articulate what music meant to him, the violin had already become a kind of language he was determined to learn. His formal training began early, as one might expect from a household so thoroughly saturated in classical tradition. Under the guidance of serious teachers, and with his father's example always before him, André developed not only the technical skills required of violinists, but something rarer, a genuine emotional relationship with the instrument. He practiced with the dedication of someone who understood, even as a child, that mastery was not given but earned through patience and repetition. By his teenage years, he was already spending hours each day at the violin, not because anyone forced him to, but because the music itself compelled him forward. In 1968, André Rieu took his ambitions to the next level by enrolling at the Royal Conservatory of Liège in Belgium, one of the most respected music institutions in Western Europe. It was a rigorous environment, demanding both technical precision and deep interpretive understanding from its students. From Liège, he continued his studies at the Conservatorium Maastricht, close to home, and eventually advanced to the Royal Conservatory of Brussels, where the standards were among the highest on the continent. These years of conservatory training were formative in ways that went well beyond technique. Rieu absorbed the full weight of the classical tradition, its discipline, its history, its demanding expectations, and its unspoken codes of behavior. He learned how to stand before an orchestra, how to read an audience, how to shape a phrase so that it communicated not just notes but meaning. He became, in the truest sense, a classically trained musician of serious capability. But the conservatory years also planted a seed of dissatisfaction that would eventually grow into something transformative. As Rieu moved through the formal world of classical performance, he began to notice something that troubled him quietly. The music he loved, the waltzes of Johann Strauss II, the sweeping melodies of the great Romantic composers, music that had once made people dance and weep and laugh, was being presented to audiences in a way that kept them at arm's length. Concert halls were hushed, formal, almost sacred in their atmosphere. Audiences sat in silence, afraid to cough. The joy that had originally animated this music had been replaced by a kind of reverence that, while respectful, was also cold. Rieu began to ask himself a question that would define the rest of his career. What if classical music could be brought back to the people? What if it could be freed from its formal prison and returned to the warmth and celebration it was originally meant to generate? In 1978, André Rieu married Marjorie Rieu, and in doing so found not just a life partner, but professional one. Marjorie would prove to be one of the most significant forces in shaping what Rieu eventually became. Behind the scenes, she took on responsibilities that went far beyond the domestic. As Rieu's career began to build momentum, it was Marjorie who often handled the business side of their growing enterprise, managing logistics, coordinating appointments, and ensuring that the machinery of his career operated smoothly while he focused on the music. Their partnership was, by all accounts, one built on genuine mutual respect and shared vision. Together they raised 2 sons, and despite the increasing pressures and demands of a career that would eventually take Rieu to every corner of the globe, the family remained a grounding force in his life. He spoke of Marjorie often in interviews, not in the polished language of public relations, but with the kind of genuine warmth that suggested someone who truly understood how much he owed to her steadiness and commitment. What very few people outside their closest circle knew, however, was just how much Marjorie shaped not only the business of André Rieu, but the very concept of what an André Rieu concert would become. The visual spectacle, the theatrical staging, the costumes, the decision to make audiences feel like guests at a grand celebration rather than observers at a formal recital. Much of this was developed in conversation between husband and wife, in private, away from cameras and interviews and the noise of public life. The double life that Rieu was quietly leading was not one of deception, but a deliberate concealment, a creative partnership so deep and so central to everything he did that revealing its full scope would have changed the way the world understood his work. The year 1987 marked the moment when André Rieu's private vision became a public reality. He founded the Johann Strauss Orchestra, named deliberately after the composer whose spirit he most wanted to revive. The orchestra began modestly, a small ensemble of musicians who shared Rieu's conviction that classical music could be presented with joy and accessibility, without sacrificing quality or integrity. In those early years, the concerts were intimate affairs. Local venues, small theaters, audiences of a few hundred people who were curious about this unusual conductor who encouraged them to clap along, who smiled at them from the stage, who seemed to genuinely enjoy their company. This was radical in the context of the classical music world, where the relationship between performer and audience had long been defined by a kind of formal distance. Rieu dismantled that distance deliberately and systematically, one concert at a time. What grew from those humble beginnings was something no one in the classical music establishment had anticipated. By the early 1990s, the Johann Strauss Orchestra was touring across Europe, playing to increasingly large audiences, releasing recordings that sold in numbers more commonly associated with pop music, and generating a level of popular enthusiasm for classical repertoire that had not been seen in generations. Critics in the classical world were divided. Some dismissed Rieu as a populist who was diluting a great tradition, while others recognized that he was doing something genuinely valuable by bringing music to people who would otherwise never have encountered it. During the 1990s, as his European fame grew, Rieu's concerts evolved from musical events into full theatrical productions. The Johann Strauss Orchestra began performing in period costumes, inspired by the elegance of 19th century Vienna. Stage sets became more elaborate. Dancers in flowing gowns joined the ensemble. Soloists from different musical traditions were invited to perform alongside the orchestra, creating programs that moved fluidly between classical, operatic, and popular styles. The effect on audiences was extraordinary. People who had spent their entire lives believing that classical music was not for them found themselves moved to tears by a Strauss waltz performed in a stadium, surrounded by thousands of other listeners who felt exactly the same thing. There was something deeply human about what Rieu was creating, a reminder that music at its most fundamental level is a communal experience, not an exclusive one. Television played a crucial role in amplifying his reach. broadcast concerts and documentary specials introduced Rieu to audiences far beyond those who could attend his live shows. In living rooms across Europe, people watched this curly-haired violinist conduct his orchestra with visible pleasure, pause and speak directly to his audience, sharing jokes, telling stories, creating the feeling that everyone in the room or watching from home was personally invited to the celebration. By the early 2000s, André Rieu had become something entirely unprecedented in the world of classical music, a genuine global superstar. His tours expanded to North America, Australia, South Africa, and across Asia. Arenas and stadiums that had previously hosted rock concerts and sporting events were now filled with audiences of tens of thousands who had come to hear Viennese waltzes performed by an orchestra in period costume on a stage designed to resemble an imperial palace. The scale of the productions grew to match the scale of the ambition. Some of his most spectacular concerts recreated the atmosphere of the great ballrooms and palace gardens of 19th century Vienna, with elaborate set designs, theatrical lighting, and the full sensory experience of a world that most audience members had only ever encountered in history books or films. One of the most celebrated of these productions featured a stage modeled on the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, transforming an ordinary arena into a vision of imperial grandeur that left audiences breathless. Behind all of the spectacle, however, was a discipline and a seriousness that Rieu consistently underplayed in public. The logistical complexity of organizing tours at this scale, moving an orchestra of dozens of musicians, technical crews, elaborate stage equipment, and all the supporting personnel across multiple countries, required a level of planning and organizational capacity that rivaled any major entertainment enterprise in the world. And yet Rieu consistently presented himself to the public not as a business mogul or a corporate entertainer, but as a musician who simply loved music and wanted to share it. This was, in its own way, the most carefully maintained aspect of his double life. The public André Rieu was warm, spontaneous, joyful, and seemingly unconcerned with anything as mundane as finances or logistics. The private André Rieu was deeply involved in every aspect of the enterprise that bore his name, meticulous, strategic, and intensely aware of every detail that shaped the experience his audiences received. He understood that the apparent effortlessness of his concerts was itself a product of enormous effort, and he worked hard to ensure that the machinery behind the magic remained invisible. The hidden dimension of Rieu's life that has only recently begun to receive wider attention concerns the depth of his personal commitments outside the world of performance. For nearly 30 years, while the world watched him conduct and perform and entertain, Rieu was engaged in a private life of extraordinary richness that he deliberately chose not to display publicly. His home in Maastricht, a historic chateau that he and Marjorie restored over many years, became the center of a private world that stood in striking contrast to the glittering spectacle of his stage productions. Here, away from cameras and journalists, Rieu lived as a family man with deep roots in his hometown and community. He was known locally not as an international celebrity, but simply as a neighbor, someone who walked his dogs through familiar streets, who cared about the well-being of those around him, who maintained friendships that had nothing to do with music or fame. The chateau itself became the setting for another hidden chapter of his story. Rieu invested not only money but personal passion in the restoration of the building, working with craftsmen and historians to ensure that the renovation honored the architectural heritage of the structure. For a man who built a professional reputation on recreating the elegance of a vanished era, there was something deeply consistent about this private project. He was not simply performing nostalgia on stage. He was genuinely devoted to it in his own home and life. What emerged from a gradual revelation of this private world was a portrait of a man far more complex and layered than the persona he had cultivated for public consumption. The André Rieu the world knew was a showman of extraordinary skill and charm. The André Rieu that those closest to him knew was something quieter and in many ways more interesting, a man of serious cultural convictions, deep personal loyalties, and a vision of music's role in human life that went well beyond entertainment. The question that naturally arises when considering a life lived with such deliberate division between public and private is, why? Why did Rieu work so hard to keep the deeper dimensions of his life and work hidden from the world that celebrated him? The answer, it seems, lies in his understanding of what he was trying to create for his audiences. André Rieu built his career on the idea that music should feel like a gift, something freely given effortlessly beautiful, requiring nothing from the audience except their presence and their willingness to be moved. If the enormous labor and strategy and vision behind his concerts had been fully visible, something of that magic would have been lost. The illusion, not of dishonesty, but of grace, would have been broken. Audiences come to an André Rieu concert to feel transported, not to be reminded of the logistical complexity that made the transportation possible. There is also, beneath this professional calculation, something more personal. Rieu has always struck those who know him well as a man with a genuine need for a life that belongs entirely to himself, a space where he is not the maestro, not the brand, not the phenomenon, but simply a man who loves music and his family and his hometown, and a particular quality of light over the Maastricht rooftops on a winter morning. The double life he lived was not a deception, but a protection, of something he valued too much to put on display. Today, as André Rieu moves through his 70s, the full story of his life is gradually coming into clearer focus. The concerts continue. The audiences continue to fill stadiums, and the Johann Strauss Orchestra continues to bring the music of a vanished era to people who might never otherwise have encountered it. But the man behind the music is no longer quite as hidden as he once was. Interviews, documentaries, and the accumulated testimony of those who have worked alongside him for decades have begun to sketch the outlines of someone whose depth and complexity have always exceeded the charming image he presented to the world. What that portrait reveals is not a scandal or a betrayal, but something arguably more surprising. A man whose public life and private life, though carefully separated, were always in service of exactly the same thing, a belief held with genuine passion and remarkable consistency across more than half a century, that music is one of the most powerful forces available to human beings, that it can break down barriers of class and education and culture, that it can make people who have nothing in common feel, for the duration of a waltz, that they share something essential. André Rieu lived a double life for 30 years. But both lives, it turns out, were devoted to exactly the same dream,